Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Shreeman, writer-director EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachael Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
All right, so hi, it's good to see you again.
Hi, great to be back and to see your face again.
You're starting to wear fall clothes. You've got your sweater on.
I've got my sweater on. It was a brisk 49 degrees this morning here in Vermont, but we're already up to a bright, sunny 64 degrees. So it's going to be a gorgeous fall day.
I'm really excited for our audience today because we met Chief Hopley, who was the first person to interview Alfredo Prieto when he was arrested on the West Coast for the murder of Yvette Woodruff. So that was in 1990. He was also present at the crime scene for this horrific triple rape, and we had
Abduction.
2 survivors, abduction, right? That was the event that first got him jailed after the series of murders that we don't find out about until later. And you all vibed a little bit as chiefs.
Oh yeah, no, I mean he was really great to talk to. Not only did I learn so much more about the broader circumstance around Rachael and Warren's case, but I also got to meet a colleague, a brother in blue, which is never wasted time.
Let's introduce Eric Hopley to our audience.
All right, can't wait. Good morning, Eric. I'm Jen Morrison. It's nice to meet you in person.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Andrea and I went to college together a million years ago. So this is in addition to being a passion project for both of us because of our friend and my teammate, our friends being murdered. We actually really like each other. So this has been a great opportunity for us to spend more time together.
It's interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that, refreshing my knowledge from working this case and in talking to Andrea before, I think there's so many people that have been touched, of course, negatively, but touched by Mr. Prieto's actions throughout the country. Everyone brings a little piece of the puzzle to his history that has negatively affected all our history. You guys being friends and close to victims, my role investigating the murder of a 15-year-old female who was brutally raped and shot in the mouth. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but so we all bring that little component to this, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's so true. I've talked at length with Andrea about when you're the lead investigator or part of an investigative team, no matter your role, particularly if you're assigned as the family liaison investigator, you get really aware of how wide the ripples go. And then when you step back and look at the impact on a neighborhood or a community, sometimes like in some of the cases we worked here in Vermont, because we're such a small state, you have the whole University of Vermont community being impacted or the entire state being impacted. So the ripple effects of these cases are definitely wide and deep. I mean, here we are, 30 years later, and we're still moved to tears at times talking about this case.
Yeah, I didn't mean to get too far ahead.
Oh, it's okay. There's no order here.
There's truly no order. I just welcome you to just start where you are.
Sure, thanks.
What's on your mind about this?
Yeah, I think as us that have worked in law enforcement for a few years, those are the scars. You kind of hinted on it, Jen. This is a case that I will remember my whole life, just not the mere fact of responding out to a 15-year-old's death in the middle of a vacant field, in the middle of the night, with her half-naked body and her being shot, but more so the investigation and then actually sitting in the room with, and I really don't like to use his name.
You don't have to.
Yeah, because I think in my mind kind of glorifies who he was, even though he's been executed. But sit in the same little 5x7 interview room with Prieto across the table from him. And though the interview was about 8 minutes long, him just staring back at us. My partner was a female, a detective named Jean Irvin, who's since passed. And he looked right at us, and I know you're probably going to play this to an audience, so I don't want to use profanity, but
Go
just
ahead.
swore. Well, he just looked at both of us and said, fuck you guys. I equate it to if you ever watched the movie Scarface with Al Pacino and the character of Tony Montana. It was just like that, little 120-pound El Salvadorian looking across from us. But I remember going home and telling my wife, I said, and since then, remember, if you believe in evil, that was the closest I've ever been to true, pure evil. And then later on, and we can talk about this, I'm sure, later on, about the DNA and CODIS hits, really understanding. I was sitting in the room 3 feet away from a true serial killer, but I think it sets in later on, really, there's those type of people out there. And, you see and hear those type of activities on TV and certain movies, and everyone's fascinated by that. But until you actually sit in the same room and are that close, and you actually touch that person when you're putting handcuffs on or whatever, this is real. And of course, as you know, it doesn't set in because you're charged with putting a case together, the adrenaline of that, bringing closures for the family, getting a dangerous person off the street. At that time, back in the 90s, when I was running the gang unit, you had other gang crimes and murders going on. And so you just kind of get swooped up in it. And then later on, you start realizing the significance of this case. And then when Andrea reached out to me, a year ago or whatever, it brings back all those, they're negative memories, but there's been at least resolution to this case. There are so many victims' families that have not had resolution. That's the sad part. So at least there's been resolution to this.
Can I ask you a little question about, you said, it doesn't set in when you're on the job, you're on to the next case, you're churning through. This is a little bit of a side road that Andrea and I have gone down a little bit about the cumulative effect of exposure to depravity on law enforcement detectives or others, could be victim advocates, et cetera, other people involved in the justice system. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about, like, when did some of these thoughts come back? Was it only when we reached out about the project? Or for me, it was about 6 weeks after I retired from law enforcement, from being actively involved in policing. I started having dreams. And they weren't exactly nightmares, but they were really intense dreams. I think about being open about it so that the people doing the job right now have some tips and tricks, or know that you don't just file this away in a jumble and it never comes back.
Yeah. And right now, it's okay to say that. It's okay to reach out, because 10, 20, 30 years ago, it really wasn't. We suppressed it by going out and drinking a six-pack or something after work, choir practice, so to speak.
Yep, choir practice.
But I think for me, my long-term marriage to my wife, who is a marriage family counselor, has helped keep me in check. So when I came home from work from those big cases or those brutal cases, she knew, and she could tell my body language, and she could say, okay, what's wrong? What's going on? And of course, cops want to suppress that because they don't want to bring that home to their house where their kids are. Even if it's just talking about it, you're bringing that horrific event or whatever it is to home, and you want to, take the shower, change the clothes, and leave that at work. And she was able to pull that out of me, and her and I have shared this case. We were just actually talking this morning. This is the second case that I was involved in that involved capital murder. I mean, we've done other murder cases, but 2 of them have resulted in the execution of the perpetrators. This one, and then another one in Ohio that I worked when I was a young patrolman back in 1984. it's interesting. You start reflecting on the impact you've had protecting society. And nowadays we can call it PTSD or whatever, but just starts piling up after a while. But I think for me, triaging it and the years go by helps to get it out. And so I was, and am still, because I'm still in the business, so fortunate to have my wife present and that I can get a lot of that out where I know so many people in our business can't. It's all bottled up and they don't have that release, so to speak. So I think to answer your question, I think over the years I've been able to release that or at least talk through it so it hasn't built up. And fully understanding everyone is different, but being in a social atmosphere where it's okay to talk about things and not just suppress all that. So it has helped me.
It's amazing. One of the classification of heroes we've identified in the Hero Maker podcast is the law enforcement spouse.
Mm-hmm. And ex-spouse sometimes too, because they're not real great track records of being married. And so for my 36 years, but I always tell her, I said, it's bad business for a marriage family counselor to be divorced. So that's why she stays with me.
I would like to circle back to some of the things that you said, Chief.
Sure.
You talked about, and I don't know if this is stuff that you read in the case or if you were actually there. Were you at the crime scene? Did you actually see Yvette?
Yeah.
I did not realize that. I thought you were just the first to interview Prieto because of your expertise in understanding gangs, or you can explain this better than I can, but tell us about that.
Sure. At that time, I was attached to a gang, and we had a three-person gang unit. And anytime there was a violent crime involving a gang member, the detectives in the detective bureau that worked homicide or whatever, would roll out on those, and we would come with them because we had the gang expertise. We knew who people were. A lot of times had relationships with the different gang members, and so oftentimes they would come up with a nickname or a moniker of someone, and we would know who that is. And so we assisted the detectives. So we weren't the main lead, but we helped them. And so that particular night, I think it was September 2nd, that we had been told 3 people had been kidnapped from a house in Ontario. It was a known Mexican mafia house, a lot of drug dealing from. And about, I think, 4 men had kidnapped the mom and 2 daughters. Yvette Woodruff's body, she's 15 years old, is found out in the east part of our town. At that time, pretty desolate, large kind of warehouses out that way. So anyway, we get out to the crime scene, and she's propped up against a tree. And it appeared that she had been raped, and then a gun had been put in her mouth, and the exit wound is in the back of the head. The mother of the other juvenile and the juvenile are alive and have run off from the crime scene, and so are witnesses, and they're being interviewed. And that's kind of how we get introduced to the case. We have 2 live victims who were not raped but had superficial wounds, knife wounds, but ran off from the crime scene. And so that's how the case is discovered. We then hear, they're kidnapped from this Mexican mafia house, and start kind of backtracking. And so that's my involvement of getting out to the crime scene, seeing Yvette Woodruff there. I had previously had contact with her because I knew her gang member boyfriend. So I recognized her, and I thought, okay, this is not only a big crime, but I'm going to have to now interact with her gang member boyfriend, who is, 15 or 16. That's kind of the short story, how I get involved in the case.
Wow. You're such a knowledge keeper for the information that we're seeking to get some kind of answers to understand the breadth of this person's crimes. You were there. I know it cannot be easy to kind of revisit some of these things, and so I just am grateful that you're willing to do it. This is new information for me, that the 2 other women were not raped. I did not know that. I thought that they had been raped as well.
It's been a long time. It could have happened, but the 2 other suspects in that case did not want to kill them. From the testimony and interviews, Prieto had been yelling at them, stab him, kill him, because he did not obviously want to leave witnesses. And they didn't. I specifically remember the superficial wounds, like on the arms and things. I could be wrong on the rape aspect.
So even among bad guys, he was like a real bad guy. Even the bad guys didn't want to do what he was doing.
Correct. And if you fast forward a little bit, we started receiving anonymous tips the next day, right away, that he was the suspect. From what we could tell were gang members. They were actually calling up and, they wouldn't give their names, but you could tell by talking to them. They did not condone what occurred, and they were identifying him. His moniker name was Spider. There's a town next door to Ontario in LA County to the east called Pomona, and he was identified as a Pomona North Side gang member, but he was living in Ontario. But you had other gang members calling and saying, hey, this is who did it. One, I think because of the severity of the crime, but two is the house they were at was run by, allegedly, the Mexican Mafia as a drug house. And it was not a sanctioned Mexican Mafia hit. And so they, I'm sure, were concerned that there was going to be an upheaval from those running the Mexican Mafia. So there was a lot of underlying components as to the kidnapping and where it occurred and who they were. And so I think that led to a lot of the tips right out of the gate, because they wanted this guy in custody quickly. And he was.
They didn't want to bring heat on somebody else's safe house or whatever you want to call it.
In Southern California at that time, the Mexican Mafia was very prevalent, Hispanic gang, and it was very big in Ontario and Southern California at the time. So there was a lot going on. And wielded a lot of power.
How did you get that area of specialty? How did that happen for you? And
working gangs?
Yeah.
I grew up in a smaller town to the north, Upland. And I actually worked for Upland Police Department for 2 years and then came to Ontario and started working pretty aggressively the gangs when I came down there, and just kind of immersed into it. And it was something that clicked with me. And because of my contact with a lot of the gang members, creating relationships, even though sometimes people could be criminals, it's how you treat them. And they understand that. So you create relationships. That's kind of an odd thing to say with criminal suspects. And occasionally you make them either into informants, or they're not afraid to talk to you about what's going on in the community. And I think through my background doing that, then I was selected as a detective to run the gang. And so I had 2 other patrol officers that worked with me. There's 3 of us. And then your day-to-day duties was either working with the DA and the district attorney, putting cases together and testify as an expert in court, or being out on the street. The emphasis was to be on the street, driving those neighborhoods every day, stopping and talking, what's going on, what are you doing here, who are you hanging out with, did you get a new tattoo, who's your girlfriend, who's slinging dope, because rock cocaine is big at that time, methamphetamine is just coming into the circuit. So it's being able to have all that intelligence of being out there every day, because things change every day. And then, okay, who are you? Why are you from LA? Why are you out here? Because we're a suburb, as you know, Andrea, east of LA, 35, 40 miles. What are you doing? Who are you hiding from? Why are you out here? And what's your connection to Ontario? And just knowing all that intelligence. So if then something happens, hey, we had a robbery and the guy's got a certain kind of tattoo, we go, oh, that's so-and-so. We know from being out there. And so you're able to supply that. And I think that just really clicked with me of, I was going to say fun, but very interesting work. And it kind of just fell into it.
It's so complex.
These are organized criminal enterprises. These are,
But just the level of what Chief is doing out there, what you're describing, that, like, I've known some undercover agents, right? But you're not. Mm-hmm. You're out there in the uniform.
Right.
And you're forging relationships. It's just fascinating.
Speaking of undercover, I did about 10 years off and on. I had the long beard and the earring and drove my wife crazy because she looked like a dirtbag. But I did that also, and that was fun. But the gang aspect, I'm not glorifying it at all, because so many people do that now, and so many people do it way better than than what I did. I worked with a patrolman that was just an encyclopedia, and he solved several murders by just, the description of a vehicle or the description of a suspect. He says, "Oh, I think I know that so-and-so." And he was right.
I'd like to take a little step back. We dove right in and we went deep quickly. Can you take us through the arc of your career? Because you're now in the district attorney's office and you're the lead investigator there. And it sounds like you've done a lot of really interesting things. Can you just share your journey as a police officer in law enforcement, like what you've done over the years for our audience?
Yeah, sure. Oh, absolutely. Again, very blessed. Fell into a career. I was going to community college, never wanted to be a police officer. A friend of mine who we were taking classes together said, "Hey, I'm taking this administration of justice class. It's pretty cool. You should come over and try one of these." I took a couple and I got hooked on the law. And so this particular police department, Upland, was just starting a cadet program. They didn't really know what to do with it, but they knew they wanted to start one. And one of my instructors was a captain there and said, "We're starting this program, but you have to go to school. You can work 20 hours, but you still have to go to school, be enrolled. Hey, this kind of sounds fun. They're going to pay you." And so I was actually Upland PD's first cadet. They had no idea what to do with me and went around counting dog licenses for 6 months and stuff, but they knew they had to have a cadet program, so they're trying to put it together. And then I turned 21 and they said, "Hey, you want to go to the police academy?" I said, "No, sure." I had gone on a bunch of ride-alongs, and I got, as Jen knows, once you get that little taste of law enforcement, being in the car, you get the bug. So I had learned a lot from being mentored by these other young officers who saw me coming up and would go on ride-alongs and help fill out some reports and talking on the radio. So I knew how to do all that, and went to the academy and then was there 2 years. About a year and a half into that job, I had told you I had been involved in another capital murder case before that. So I'm 22 years old and happened across two gentlemen at a gas station at 3:00 in the morning, right off the 10 freeway, which leads right down into Los Angeles. Contact them, and they're both wanted in a murder and a robbery of a jewelry store in Hamilton County, Ohio. Me and a sergeant take them into custody. We find the murder weapon, clothes with blood all over it, the felt trays with all the jewelry still in the car, all that stuff. That becomes a big deal. And then detectives from Hamilton County, Ohio come out. And then I'm involved in a couple other robbery cases. Well, I get, not because I have my act together, but it's right place, right time. I get Officer of the Year pretty quick and was immersed in some of these pretty high profile cases right out of the gate, which taught me, because I was interacting with detectives and people that were 10, 15, 20 years on the job, and they were teaching me. They saw me as a kid. So I kind of hung around them, and here you want to go to the autopsies, or here you want to go. And so they kind of took me under their wing, because I knew some of them before when I was a cadet. And so I was blessed by the mentoring process. That's still something I hold dear now. People took the time to teach me. And then kind of to sprout my wings, I transferred to the Ontario Police Department, which was easily twice the size, just a town to the south, kind of starting all over. But I got married, bought a house, changed jobs, all in the same month. Thought my wife was going to kill me at that point.
That is a lot of change in 1 month.
Just say you had a kid too, and a puppy, because now you're hitting them all.
Did have a dog. When I talk about my wife going through all that change was really tough on her. Or, being a young cop, you just say, whatever, it'll work out. But then working in Ontario, very diverse community. I came from a very white community, upper middle class, to Ontario, which was very blue collar, easy 2 or 3 times the size town, a lot more crime. So it was a culture change for me, because I had grown up in Upland too. It's a very diverse community, which I enjoyed, and worked my way up through the ranks there. We can kind of compress all that, and ended my career. I was the police chief there for 5.5 years, and was very blessed to have a great staff and great people that we still stay in contact with. And then went to the private sector for 3 years. And then in our county, which is San Bernardino County, a new district attorney got elected, and it was someone that I had had a relationship with. When he was a young lawyer, we had done cases together. Fast forward that he was on the city council in Ontario, and then eventually elected as the district attorney, and the chief of their investigations, who I knew and we were good friends, was there and was going to retire. And so the DA asked me to come over and to run what we call the Bureau of Investigations, which, just like a police department, I've got 60 sworn investigators, like detectives, and then about 15 professional staff people. So back into law enforcement, which I love. And this is a whole different aspect of, for me, being on the back side now of a case instead of the front side of a case. Before, you were taking the reports and arresting people. Now this is the back side of the follow-up afterwards. We have a very large victim advocate bureau, and so we work hand in hand with the victim advocates. And so this is our way of giving back and helping the victims. We talked about that in the beginning about victims, and so this is a way to really connect with them. So that's kind of compressed pretty quick.
What did you do in the private sector, just out of curiosity?
So there's a large electric company, Andrea knows the name, Southern California Edison.
Yep.
My dad had worked for them for 40 years or so. They had a job opening in corporate security. And so I ran and worked with about 11 investigators working internal theft, external theft,
Sure.
threats to the company. And so I did that for about 3 years. And then this great opportunity came closer to home, back into law enforcement. I think it was good, as you kind of understand, when you get out of law enforcement, but you're still working criminal matters, you're kind of, excuse the pun, handcuffed, but your resources are a lot more limited. And so you have to use a lot more thought and resources and relationships. And so it really reinforced that with me. And then coming back into law enforcement, it was like, oh, I'm able to get all this information. So it's kind of a full circle for me.
I want to go kind of in a different direction for a quick minute, because I keep coming back to it as we're talking. You now have the benefit of hindsight. Mm-hmm. Knowing what you know now about the prolific nature of Prieto and his crimes, how did he escape detection for so long?
So I'll use a little bit different aspect of that question. I look back at the mistake of interviewing him with a female partner. Had I known all those other cases existed where he victimized women so brutally, raping them, killing them, obviously there was an issue there. And then for us to bring in a female investigator, had I known all that stuff, I wouldn't have done that. We would not have done that. So that was a mistake we made in the interview. No harm, no foul, because he was not going to say anything.
I'd say you
anyway.
couldn't have known. So
right. But I did meet the detective from Virginia, Bob Murphy, I believe is his name, came out. And so I think I've learned more about the East Coast cases by getting on the internet and reading than, Bob and I had a great conversation and stayed with us a couple of days to go over everything. And so we did learn some stuff there. But I think in perspective, reading about the cases in the East Coast that I didn't even know about. And then also interesting twist. There was a double murder in Riverside County, a male and a female there. I know the male's last name was Giannuzzi.
Well, so Tony Giannuzzi and Stacy Segrist, but Tony's dad was on the force, Gene Giannuzzi, who passed within the last 2 years. But I did get to meet Gene. So I wonder, you probably knew a little bit more about that because it was a cop's kid. But I think you did know Gene. But I don't want to take you off the track of what you're saying. If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info@theheromakerpodcast.com.
wherever you're going, I'm dying to hear it. Is this another one of Prieto's victims?
Yeah. I'll kind of tie it back to the question that you asked me. So May 5th, 1990, Stacy Seacrest, she's 19, and Tony Giannuzzi, who's 21, are abducted and murdered in Riverside County, which is a county right next to San Bernardino County. I want to say 15 miles or so fairly close, but we don't know this. Fast forward till the end, Prieto is extradited back to Virginia to stand trial, and during that time, through DNA, and Prieto is identified in that double homicide. So we get contacted by Riverside Sheriff's Department and say, hey, we're involved in this case now too. They're talking about, once Prieto's done with his trial in Virginia, to extradite him back to California and try him on these 2 double murders. And now the strategy comes together, and the prosecutors are all talking because you don't want to interrupt one trial. And, there was some retrying going on in Virginia. And so, Andrea, you're right that Gene Giannuzzi, the father of Tony, I knew, and I've known for 25 years until his passing. He was a retired LA County Sheriff's deputy, opened up a uniform store in the city of Montclair, which is right next to Upland in Ontario. So I used to go as a kid, and then as I went up through the ranks, go over there buying my uniforms and typical stuff at a uniform shop. So I knew Gene, and I did not know about the homicide until this. I didn't know his kid had been kidnapped and murdered during that whole time period.
That is incredible.
They did not try Prieto and Riverside for those double murders. The strategy was to leave him on the East Coast, and if time prevailed, which it has, he'd be executed on the East Coast instead of interrupted to be brought back, extradited back to California for another double homicide trial. So again, a weird situation.
Were you ever aware of the older couple, Herbert and Lula Farley, and did you come into contact at all with that double homicide?
Yeah, it was behind
along the way?
Yeah, it was behind a grocery store. They were picking up cans out of a dumpster, and she was killed there at the scene. An elderly couple, and I use that term endearingly now because I'm kind of elderly, but elderly couple at the time. And then he's later found down in Jurupa, Riverside County, close to the crime scene of the Giannuzzi victim. I was trying to look at my notes real quick of what the date was at, but they're all very close in 1990.
I would love to talk to somebody who investigated that, because when I spoke with a vet's friend, she was like, they understood gang violence because they lived among different gangs, and their friends at some point at 14, 15 would start to choose a color or choose a side. But when that older couple was murdered in the neighborhood, they were like, whoa, this is dark. Who would murder an older couple collecting cans?
Well, we surmised it was for their vehicle. They had if I remember right, it was a Honda or smaller compact car, of just because they needed a car. But to the extent of, hey, just push him down and take their car, why kidnap him or why kill her? It's a very senseless murder.
So we are interviewing you right now at the tail end of National Forensic Science Week. And I wonder if you can say something about the importance of forensics and access to professional laboratories, forensic labs in cases like this.
Sure. Again, another interesting twist. My 31-year-old daughter is in law enforcement, and she works forensics for the city that I started in, the city of Upland. So she caught on to not only the law enforcement bug, but she was really intrigued by the science part of it. And so she does their forensics and evidence for the department I first started at.
That's so cool.
Yeah, interesting. Kind of, these all have a little twist to them. My son is also a police officer for that same city too. He's 4 years younger. But when you talk about forensics, so you go back in time when we get notified by Virginia from from the detective that, hey, we have a DNA hit on your guys' case, but our cases are way before yours. So he comes out, and as cops do, we're sitting by the pool at the hotel he's staying at, drinking a beer and talking about how our cases are related. And his big question was, why did this DNA take so long in CODIS to get a hit? And during that particular time, our organization had made a decision to start its own forensics program and had moved away from using the county as dumping all our evidence to the county. Thus, Jen, as I think you probably know, to be able to dump evidence and results into CODIS, they have to be from a law enforcement lab,
Right.
an accredited lab. At that time, we were using a private lab to analyze our stuff, which was still admissible in court, but it wasn't a law enforcement lab. So our evidence was not being dumped into CODIS.
Interesting.
For a couple of years, yes. And so explaining that, why the lack of time now, had the resolve that it wouldn't have saved lives, that occurrence. So that was good. It was just connecting all the pieces together. And so once we then joined back to the sheriff's department, our items started being analyzed by a law enforcement lab, gets dumped into CODIS, and then you fast forward, all the hits start hitting together. So when you talk about forensics, it's huge. The genealogy nowadays is, you talk about over a 30 or 40-year time period, we've really seen it change. There are unfortunately factions in our communities that are trying to limit the use of DNA and trying to limit technology, but it's fantastic. There should be plenty of grants for this, that the community should be pushing for this. The U.S. government should be pushing for advanced DNA, for science, because it's evidence-based, it's provable, and it's not witchcraft. It's not stuff people are making up. And through the discovery process, it can be validated. And it was the wave of the future 20, 30 years ago, and we need to be pushing forward even stronger now.
That leads me to policy level questions that I think about when one of the things that we're trying to do is squeeze out any recommendations for the future, whether those are legislative requirements or just best practices in law enforcement. I wonder if you see, in the reflection of your very distinguished career and busy career, shall I say, any policy level or top level lessons that we've learned in the last 25 years and what we should be doing.
Yeah, I think things are very circular, so to speak. Things we're experiencing right now are nothing new. And I can only speak mostly for Southern California because that's my little tip of the spear, though you're cognizant of what's occurring across the United States. Crime is on the rise. Violent crime is on the rise. I think everywhere, unless you live in a little Vermont community that, off to
It's
yourself.
on the rise in Vermont too, sadly.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But this, again, in law enforcement, this is nothing new. We've seen this before. This is how, especially in California, the 3 strikes laws came about. There were some brutal, brutal crimes back then that through legislation, people said, okay, enough's enough. Then nowadays, it's not popular, so things are getting overturned and people are getting out of prison a lot quicker. Violent people with distinctly bad backgrounds are being released, and there are career criminals. It's our job. We're charged with protecting society, and we know this, and it's unfortunately become political that these people are being released, and I'm not saying everyone that's being released is a bad person, but you have to study history because history has a tendency to repeat itself, and it's the same in human beings. And I by no means say that people can't be rehabilitated, and I think it's our job in society to provide those avenues of rehabilitation, if it's not working, then some people should be locked up to protect society. That's our main charge in law enforcement. That's why security in law enforcement was started, was to protect communities. So often people forget that.
I appreciate that.
I'm almost hearing this theme from you a little bit about, nothing is sweeping. People are individuals. Yes, of course, there are some people who have rehabilitated and it's time for them to re-enter society, and we can support them in that. But all of this sweeping legislation that let's get as many people out of the jails as we can, you want to make sure those are the right people.
Correct. And you're in California, so you distinctly understand what I'm talking about. And I am not a politician. I don't particularly like to be involved in that because I'm a baseball guy. The people that I work with, I give them baseball analogies, is you have to understand the rules before you can play the game. And so paying attention to what's occurring in your state legislation are the rules. And they're setting the rules, and then we play the game. So
I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but there's a current trend, I guess would say, around sealing and expunging criminal records, and particularly expungement troubles me, acting like something never happened, which of course becomes the basis for so many other things, whether or not somebody's eligible for firearms purchases, sentence enhancements for prior bad acts if they are convicted in the future. And I don't know what's happening out in California, but I think that the well-intentioned policy level things that are intended to give folks the ability to reset the clock and not be haunted by a mistake they made in their youth, have been completely conflated with super permissiveness, that everybody who committed a crime before they were 25 and their frontal lobe was developed should be erased. And there's so many problems with this from as a police chief's lens, but I don't know if you have any thoughts, if you guys are going down that same road in California or not, but the sealing and particularly the expungements seem to me to be not at all common sense and a really dangerous precedent.
Completely agree. We are going down that road here. We're directly affected with the district attorney's office, and it's called pardon and rehabs. And so we do an investigation for pardon and rehabs when people make that application. And I think you're exactly right. Again, there's a reason why we study history, because it means something. I am by no means want to hold someone back if they've been rehabilitated and they need this clear path to employment or driver's license or whatever it is. I agree to a point. It should not erase those records that if they do commit another crime, that those past crimes, whether they were mistakes or not, because I was going to use the word mistake, but they might not have been mistakes, can be used against them because they happen. It's not like wave the magic wand and everything goes away. That shouldn't be. And I think you're right. There's good intentions behind it, but as we spoke earlier, everyone's individual, and these all need to be looked at individually. Again, at the end of the day, we're charged with protecting society and protecting our communities. And so often nowadays legislation is being used to erase that. So
and make it harder for us to actually co-produce public safety with other stakeholders in the community. But anyway, I digress a little bit.
I wanted to ask about...
I have a quick question about vacant fields.
Go ahead.
I'm picking up on a potential theme here that Prieto perpetrated crimes or dumped bodies in vacant fields. But I mean, I knew Rachael and Warren were out on a rural area right off the Dulles Access Road, and it was a field. And now I'm hearing Yvette's case and perhaps the elderly guy. Like, are there others that are a vacant field dump? Is that his MO? Have we stumbled on an MO?
I think the Giannuzzi one was also, I had never read Riverside County's reports, but I think that was kind of an off-the-road vacant field case also. There could be something there.
I believe that his sister told me that he was set on fire.
Oh, there's a new twist.
Well, there was another guy in Virginia that he also burned in a car.
Oh, is that the guy who he had befriended?
Manuel Sermano, but I heard this from Bob Murphy, that they knew each other from work and they were friends. I believe this guy, Sermano, was found burned in a car, and I think Giannuzzi, they had trouble even identifying him. Tony, I should call him Tony. And they had to identify him through dental records or something like that. That's what I remember. Very gruesome. All the people that we've mentioned today, this is all new information for our audience and for Jennifer, because I've intentionally not shared a lot of this with Jennifer so that she can go through the experience of discovering it for the first time, learning it for the first time, and so I can actually participate in the benefit of where she wants to go with the new information as a police officer. And these people that we're mentioning today, they were all linked to Prieto once his DNA was fully in the system, and we're able to kind of point around and go, oh, he killed that person, that person, that person, that person, that person.
I want to be very clear that Vermont does not have that many homicides annually, nor did the Burlington or Colchester police. Like, they were few and far between, so I'm not a homicide investigator. However, his indiscriminate nature is shocking to me. Mm-hmm. Like, hi, we're going to murder elderly people for their car. We're going to burn people, rape women, and just shoot men to get them out of the way. All these other things. Isn't that a little bit in your experience?
Multiple people at a time. That's actually another thing too.
Ballsy, that one, the case with Yvette, like, that's seriously, I'll come back to that, but I don't know, Chief, what you think, but in my experience or knowledge of other people's experience, this seems pretty birdshot in terms of his MO.
Yeah, again, we talked about in the beginning, being in the same room and having contact with what's later known as a serial killer, which I had never imagined and never knew. And to then read through what he's allegedly done, and that's just what we know about. I'm sure there are plenty that you don't know about. To be able to explain that, I don't think you ever can, because so often we try to rationalize things that occur in society, whether it's a child being hit by a car or these things that we call accidents, so you can make sense of it, because then at least maybe there's a little resolve of, okay, this is why this happened, because we left the gate open, or whatever. In my mind, these type of cases, you can't rationalize, because you cannot think like that.
Right.
Hopefully we can't think like a serial murderer. So you can't rationalize that, because how do you put your mind where his was? So I don't think you can bring closure, and I think that's kind of what you're alluding to as well. How do you rationalize killing multiple people and kidnapping? You can't. But maybe that's a good thing we can't, because then you might be like that. So I think that's kind of my personal perspective.
I do think it's a good thing.
I do find it somewhat, I don't know, calming to know that I'm sitting here with two career officers, chiefs. You've seen so many different cases, and then especially in these metropolitan area where homicide is so much more prevalent, that this is an outlier. That in your entire profession, you came into contact with one killer like this. And sadly, I think because it's so in the media ether that, this true crime and these serial killers and all this stuff, it feels like it's out there a lot, and it's actually not. It's rare. I mean, I don't know the statistics, but if between the two of you, I guess you've each been touched by the same guy, so that's interesting. But there's been one.
Yeah, the FBI, I think, can speak to touching these serial murder type cases way better than we can, because we've only been touched by, maybe, like you said, the numbers or the percentages are so small, maybe one, or they're seeing the full scope across the country. Yeah,
that's actually a great idea, Andrea. I actually have some contacts down at the FBI. We could ask if they would be interested in having somebody from the behavioral assessment unit take a look at the case and give some input.
Just their perspective is huge. Yeah. Because they see globally what's going on.
You really touched on so many amazing things today, Eric, like mentorship and forming relationships, and this idea of that you're just there to keep the community safe. I'm very, very grateful for your time. I wonder, Jen, I feel like the biggest question I have is who else should we talk to that came into contact with this case on any level that you may know?
Mm-hmm. You said you talked to Bob Murphy
Yes.
from Virginia.
Yeah, he was great. He was really great.
Yeah, and he has that whole context that I don't have from the West Coast. I don't know, maybe I think on it and see. The detective I worked with, unfortunately, she's passed. I can find out maybe who the prosecutors were, but
I think that's going to be very important for us to understand the adjudication and his trial on the West Coast. We haven't delved into that at all. And that does bring into, I know that one or two other guys were convicted and went to prison for
the kidnapping.
For the kidnapping and potentially rape. I don't know. We'll have to look into that a little deeper.
And we don't have to do it today, but the whole Yvette situation, I understand. I mean, it's so unusual to abduct en masse, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, to take 3 people at a time.
There were initially 4 suspects, and about 2 or 3 miles away, the one says, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be involved in this. And he is let out of the car. And he wants to distance himself from what is occurring. So then we get down to the 3 defendants out of that. So, but he is identified and is charged with the kidnappings too.
I'm just thinking, obviously you don't get to testify in everything that you touch, and maybe you don't even see it as a positive. It's probably, you have to prepare for it and it's out of the normal flow of your work or whatever. But I could imagine that sometimes officers are like, please pick me. I have something meaningful to say about this.
Said no cop ever about testifying in a jury trial.
No. I think, especially back then, when communities are busy, you're kind of on to your next case. You're on to your next call. You're on to the next thing. And it doesn't really set in of, hey, do you need me? No. Okay. And you have the resolve that it'll get taken care of and you're on to another murder case. And then in retrospect, you say, oh, yeah, you didn't need me or whatever, then which is fine. But because you're busy handling other stuff.
How do you feel about everything we talked about today?
Good. I mean, it's a cleansing for me to talk about also. It's interesting to then run into other people that have been, and I use the word touched. This person touched a lot of people negatively, but, here, look at how many years later we're sitting and talking, and you knew some people and I knew some people and the detectives from Virginia knew some people, and there's so many people that touched this case because of evil. And it's sad that we now have a relationship formed out of evil, but we're trying to do something positive from it. And that's our resolve. Unfortunately, those messages, and as you know, Jen, and law enforcement get lost nowadays, but there are good people trying to make communities and things better every day. And the ones that are in law enforcement that have a misstep or do something wrong are the minority. That's the minute numbers. It's not the majority. The majority of the people are good people and they're doing good things every day. And unfortunately, that message is kind of getting lost. It's coming back around.
Yeah, I hope so.
It got lost for a while.
What do you hope comes out of our conversation, Chief? Because you didn't have to talk to us. We're really glad you did.
If it helps bring closure to the both of you, if anybody watching or listening to your podcasts can identify with it and says, oh, this might help me. I think that's why we do what we do, to help people. And it might be someone that we never even know, but it could be somebody listening who says, I got a little nugget from that. And we will never know that there's a positive influence on somebody. That's a neat thing. Or just the possibility of it occurring, instead of sitting and closing all this information off in the corner back of your brain, and it just sits there. It's now being brought out. And if someone can be affected positively from it, I think that's probably my goal and your guys' goal too.
100%. Well, we've probably taken up more of your time than we deserve, but we are super grateful for you joining us.
Thanks for being with us so much, Chief. It was great to see you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Take care, Eric. Have a great day.
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July and at the Williamson County Fair in August and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
What a career Chief Eric has. He's been around a long time, even longer than I have, I got to say, and he's still in the game. He's still working cases, although the back end of cases, and he's still out there trying to bring closure to families, to victims' loved ones, and communities. I mean, we talked about it, about the ripple effect of these crimes on entire communities, and he is still out there trying to keep his community safe. My hat's off to him. He seems like an incredible person and a talented. And
He was so soft-spoken.
yeah.
And
Not all cops are swagger and dip. I mean, I got to tell you, they're not.
It's such an interesting approach, and I'm sure that soft approach contributed a lot to his ability to form relationships with people on the street and his constituents in a way that allowed him to, like he said, he would just roll up and, what are you doing here? And, where's your girlfriend? Who's your girlfriend? Yeah.
So, yeah, information, knowledge, and relationships. That's how you solve cases.
We talked a little bit about this with Bob Murphy, but I do want to harken back. He made quite a wise choice. Maybe it was an accident, or maybe it's fate, but marrying a therapist and being able to have that safe space on a rolling basis where he could talk about the tough stuff that he was going through and experiencing. It does seem like he's one of those rare cases where he processed along the way, which you don't hear a lot about that.
Well, she certainly is better equipped. I think there are some police spouses who are that sounding board. Certainly in my case, my husband being an emergency physician and literally dealing with high-level trauma and emergencies all the time. He was also a firefighter and ran on rescue squads. And so having that glimpse into the world of emergency services made him a really great sounding board. I mean, he's not trained as a therapist. He's not...
Right, but you're saying any spouse...
I think a lot of non-therapist spouses can learn the skill set, but I do hear the thread that both of these men said, I've been able to keep my head okay and my heart okay because I have this person that I can talk to and process and offload some of what's on my, top of mind, and it is just part of the relationship. And I have to say I agree completely. My husband and indeed my ex-husband, who was also a police officer, were both absolutely crucial in being able to process things in real time. So
thank you.
Shout out once again
Thank you,
to
spouses.
all the family members, spouses, family members,
Sounding boards, friends.
Sounding boards.
Thank you, Eric Hopley.
Eric Hopley, you were the bomb. That was great.
Thanks to audio producer, mixmaster, and sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio. Thanks also to media producer Michael Doherty. And thanks to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Shreeman. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thanks so much for listening.